Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing on with our video series on The Boys, this one, it's part of The Boys, but it's actually kind of a mini series. It stands on its own apart from everything else. It doesn't really even stand on its own, right? It kind of ties into everything, which really sort of begs the question, why was it released as a mini series in the first place? You could probably skip over it, but I wouldn't suggest it. And the reason why is because this is probably the most extreme example of how the superheroes function in the heroes universe, right? So what ends up happening here is initially you pick up in the beginning with basically Homelander addressing, the media, standing out in front of the Capitol and saying, all right, guys, so things are getting ready to pop off, right? Like there's some alien invaders who are coming to Earth and they're going to attack us and all kinds of crazy stuff's going to happen. So me and my cohorts, we're all going to go into space. We're all going to fight these guys. We're going to be gone for a few days, but don't worry, we will save the world and everything will be fine. And so it's kind of like, okay, cool. So like they're going to go fight aliens. This is going to be interesting. But what you end up finding out here is that like none of that stuff's true. There are a couple things that go on and there are a couple things we need to draw attention to, really most notably the actions of the boys. Now the boys being here are actually tracking down Vic the Veep, right? And specifically, they're looking for a particular guy. And we'll actually find out who that guy is here in a second. But the crazy thing about this is that in the middle of all this, Homelander kind of comes to this realization. And what he realizes here is that he can pretty much do anything. And there's really nothing anybody can do to stop him. And this revelation kind of comes from a couple different places. But one of the big things it comes from is when he basically flies out into the sky totally naked and then comes across this Trans-Pacific airliner, right? The 747 making its way from Sydney over to America. And then he blasts the things with his heat vision, literally destroys the pilots in the cockpit, and the whole thing goes crashing down and it explodes. And it's basically like, I can do that, right? And it's the nature of Homelander, right? Like it's the reality of the superhero era that they're living in at the moment. Is what you're dealing with here is you're dealing with this scenario where you basically have these superheroes who don't really have any traditional weaknesses, right? There's no like Superman with kryptonite. There's no Green Lantern with the color yellow. That doesn't really exist here. All these superpowered beings who have no real weakness whatsoever. Vought American has positioned itself in a place to where it's kind of like the gateway, right? The access point whereby these heroes go from just being individuals who have powers, who gain their abilities from Vought American, to individuals who now have access to like money and drugs and women and all these various things. And so because of that, it gets kind of crazy because what you end up doing is picking up with the arrival of Vic the Veep himself. Now remember, Vic the Veep is the vice president of the United States, but he's a Vought American stooge, right? Like he was specifically put into the position of becoming vice president because he can essentially fly under the radar, right? I mean, when was the last time you cared about anything the vice president did? Nobody cares what the vice president does. He's basically a yes man, and there's really nothing more to it than that. His role is to just say yes to things, right? To do what Vought American wants him to do and to really do nothing more. That's why they chose him, is because he's just kind of a simple-minded cretin. He's very basic here. And so as a result of all that, you suddenly have Huey, who basically gets a phone call from Starlight. And here's the irony about all this, is neither of them is being truly honest with the other about what they do for a living. Huey, of course, we know is part of the boys, but the cover story he gave her was that he was like an insurance analyst, basically, right? I mean, people, a guy who discovers fraud, different things like that. And that's really the only role that he plays. But it's ironic here because they're both in the same location. They just can't really tell the other that they're essentially there, or at least any could, but technically like Herogasm is supposed to be undercover, right? It's supposed to be kept under wraps and no one's supposed to know about it, which kind of makes sense. But in the middle of all this, suddenly like Huey is met by the arrival of Black Noir. Now, here's a crazy thing about all this. Huey kind of snuck off a little bit in order to achieve this. At the same time, the rest of the boys are kind of preparing this particular operation, which we'll talk about here in a second. But like in the middle of all that, Huey, while he's talking to Annie and essentially like standing in, in a sewer system kind of more or less, is like snatched up by Black Noir, who basically with him, more or less, against Huey's will, which is kind of extreme there. But at the same time, what you also getting is as soon as that happens, not really what happens with Huey, but as soon as this one guy who basically looks like the Thing, Ben Grimm, comes crashing down into the pool, then that's when the operation starts. And the reason why is because this guy was designed to be a distraction. Now, in reality, he really is a stand-in for the Thing, just like all the other members of his team are a stand-in for the Fantastic Four, is really what they're designed to be. But the idea behind this operation is to use that as a distraction, get out, snatch somebody up, and we don't really know exactly who this person is supposed to be. Huey, for the most part, goes missing, right? I mean, experiencing this heinous situation, he's just kind of cowering in fear, just terrified by this whole scenario. And so ultimately, Billy Butcher's not able to find him quite readily. Instead, Huey's just sort of there and just kind of out doing his own thing. But all this basically comes to a head when you end up having Huey, who basically comes to, who essentially wakes up and then goes out there, finally ends up, meeting with Billy Butcher, only for Billy to kind of, chastise him a little bit, say, hey man, what are you doing? All this kind of crazy stuff. But for us to find out the person they were going after was a Secret Service agent by the name of Michael Lucero. Now, this guy is exceedingly important. And the reason why this is important, the reason why I chose to do this one is because this builds off what we saw with the origin of the superheroes, right? And with regards to I guess, the superpowered beings with regards to the Boys comic. And the reason for that is because while they're interrogating Michael Lucero, he basically spills the beans, right? He spills the beans on essentially everything that's going on. And what he ends up saying here is that Vought American positioning Vic the Veep to basically kind of ensure that they would eventually control the White House was not enough, right? They had to put him in there, then they had to orchestrate a series of events or have a hand in series of events that could basically position him so that either the president could be deemed incapable of doing his job, whatever the case is, Vic the Veep would ensure the popularity of Vought American. And so if you guys recall from our video where we were talking about the origin of superheroes, one of the things that Vought American wanted to do was they basically wanted to show that superheroes could be credible defense against whatever threats happen to be out there on Earth and to get them involved in the military industrial complex. And so what ended up happening is with this guy, Michael Lucero, his idea was that he always wanted to join the Secret Service. But ultimately what ended up happening is when he joined up, he was assigned to Vic the Veep. But this basically goes into the events of 9/11. And the reason why this is important is because what we talked about in the origin of superheroes is that something happened in the war room. And Dakota Bob, who's the sitting president at the time, was the one who was basically orchestrating the orders and taking control of the situation and the whole 9 yards. The issue with this is that with Vic the Veep being there, the idea of Vought American was to position superheroes so they could be, shown as like a credible defense mechanism against other threats outside the United States. And so in order to ensure that this happened, knowing that Dakota Bob was avidly against the idea of bringing superheroes into the defense system of the United States, that what ended up happening basically was Vic the Veep essentially knocked out Dakota Bob with a fire extinguisher. And when that happened, like literally nobody really saw it happen, right? Things happened so fast, nobody really saw it all go down. All they saw was that Dakota Bob was essentially knocked unconscious. And because Vic the Veep was the vice president, essentially he was the next person in charge. And that's when Vic the Veep basically told everybody, stand down, have all the jets and everything stand down, do not intercept any of these planes that are coming in through 9/11. And like that was it. That's the only order that they got. And because of the fact that the military for the most part has to follow the direction of the commander-in-chief or his immediate successor, in this case the vice president, the military had to stand down. This opened the doorway for the 7 to show up and to basically try to stop the 9/11 hijacking. Now, we knew that kind of went bonkers. It kind of flew to the wayside and really went sideways in a multitude of different ways. If you're unsure about that, feel free to check out the previous videos on it. It didn't really work out for Vought American exactly as they planned, but it worked out for them nonetheless. It was basically a display to the general public. Superheroes can be more than just comic book characters, right? They can essentially protect the United States from various threats. And so as a result of that, one of the other things that Michael Lucero says is there is a organization called Red River. Now, Red River is designed to be the Boys' stand-in for Blackwater, which was essentially like this mercenary team that had its hands in some pretty nefarious actions at the very beginnings of the Iraq and Afghan war. But the idea behind this is that Red River is essentially kind of like a independent contracting mercenary organization that was created by and usually always works for Vought American, but can be licensed out to the government at times. And so as a result of this, in order to ensure that things went the way they wanted to, what Vought American started doing was positioning members of Red River to become Secret Service agents, to basically work on their behalf as Secret Service agents. What this shows is that Vought American has been systematically over the years getting its fingers into the White House and trying to find a way to control the federal government as it exists. And the result of this is that really the president at the time, Dakota Bob, made it exceedingly easy. And the reason why he made it easy is because there was a lot of legislation that was introduced by Congress and was ultimately passed by him that essentially allowed this kind of piecemealing of congressional oversight, right? Basically, like members of Congress could receive far more campaign donations, different things like that, which basically allowed different companies to buy the government in a variety of different ways to make sure bills were passed and things. And so while it wasn't the intention of Dakota Bob to explicitly service Vought American, ultimately he did. Like ultimately he ended up kind of opening the doorway and making it possible for Vought American to get their foot in and just kind of go from there. And so what it does following this is it kind of picks up with the tail end of this, right? You have what's called the Soupies, which is basically just like the superhero award ceremony that kind of goes on here. And it's kind of a crazy thing because you sort of see this great big huge gathering of all these various guys who are here. But Michael Lucero being released by the Boys really serves the purpose of allowing him to kind of continue his mission to figure out which members of the Secret Service agency are like Red River agents and which ones are legitimately loyal to whoever they're protecting, right? Because the role of the Secret Service is they're not really loyal to the president, they're not really loyal to the vice president, they're loyal to the position, regardless of who's holding that position, right? So their job is to protect the president or the vice president. It doesn't matter who the president or the vice president is at the time. And so as a result of that, it's really kind of working in the benefit of Vought American. The problem with this is that in the middle of this whole Soupies award, Homelander basically gets up and begins a process of saying like, hey, look, here's what I did. Like I came to this realization that there's really nothing stopping us out there. We could do pretty much anything we want to. But before he spills the beans on it all and basically says, I shot down a transatlantic airliner because I could and there's nothing anybody can do to stop me, Vought American basically walks in, right? Like one of their guys essentially walks in to look at everything that's going on, and that basically shuts down Homelander. And the reason why is because even if Homelander wanted to make the move, and even if he wanted to basically say, we can conquer everything, we can tear everything down, and to really incite all these superheroes to become kind of like their own vigilantes, right? To take the law into their own hands and to do whatever it is that they want to do in absence of whatever it is that Vought American or the government wants them to do, he can't really make that move at the moment, because if he did, Vought American would pull everything out from under them. Right now, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's more politics than anything else. But if you're someone like Homelander who's essentially unstoppable, yes, you're one person, but how stoppable are you in the face of like 100 superheroes all trying to fight you at the same time? But ultimately, while all this is going down with regards to everything, with Homelander almost on the verge of like making his decree and basically rallying all the superheroes to kind of rise up against humanity, more or less, just kind of say, look, we're going to do whatever we want to do. There's nothing you can do to stop us. You also end up having Michael Lucero, who makes his move on the various agents who are out there that are part of Red River alongside the boys. And so as a result of this, a kind of shootout ensues, right? I mean, ultimately, Michael Lucero shot and killed in the process. But what this basically means is that the involvement of Vought American in the goings on of the federal government is far more deep reaching than we ever thought they were. Our idea was that they positioned a vice president in there, right? A vice presidential stooge, a guy who would just do whatever they told him to. And then ultimately it would all just kind of come to a head. What Vought American has been planning is the death of the president, to where they can off Dakota Bob. And when that goes down, then in turn, Vic the Veep will take his place. He'll serve out the rest of Dakota Bob's presidency and then run for election, and then have another 8 years possibly under his purview, and essentially Vought American controlling everything. That's the plan. That's the idea as Vought American wants to see it go down, which is a huge moment. It's a big thing to basically do here. Like the idea of taking out a sitting president, replacing it with your own puppet, and then in turn controlling the United States. Like that's a pretty significant thing to go down there, because what it could do if Vought American so chose to do that is by bringing the superheroes in, and then in turn saying like they're part of the defense system now, they can in turn use the superheroes to totally conquer the United States, right? And then like basically make themselves a kind of dictatorship, so to speak. And so it's kind of bonkers to see this whole thing play out, because that's kind of the question, is if this is the big revelation that comes out of everything that was learned from Michael Lucero, and the question is, how do the boys stop this? That's really the big question that you kind of have to ask here. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.